Our next speaker is Frank Schaeffer. He's an author, and his father is one of the founders of the religious right, Francis Schaeffer, and he has grown up to be one of the great spokespeople pointing out the harm that's caused by such religious extremism. His latest books is Sex, Mom, and God, and also Crazy for God's another one of his books. A very strong voice on these issues. Frank Schaeffer.
Good morning. It's an honor to stand here. It's interesting, when I look at the organization here, not all like that, that doesn't speak for me, because I spent a good chunk of the first part of my life exactly like that. And in fact, if you talk about someone like Tony Perkins and what he's doing today, and you interview him or a Michelle Bachmann, for instance, both of them will tell you that one of the reasons they take the stand they do within our culture is because of the work that people like my father, Francis Schaeffer, Jerry Falwell, and others did, who, quote, inspired them to get involved in politics. But it turned out that the politics that the religious right inspired is a politics of division and polarization within society that we see writ very large right now as our federal government is shut down. So I don't want to be facetious, but it occurs to me that when I looked at the latest poll yesterday of people who blame the Republican Party for the shutdown, that number's about 63%. And the way I think of the divide is that the rest who don't blame the Republican Party and the Tea Party are the people who also happen to believe that there were dinosaurs loaded onto the ark by Noah. And that's kind of the division. And I know that is a little bit flippant, but honestly what you see is a collision not just between right-wing religion and the gay community, the transgender community. What you see is a collision between a fact-based existence and a mythologically based existence, which brings a bitterness with it, because that is the losing side. And you see that most clearly written in the number of young evangelicals these days who come out of the same background that I did, who would be very comfortable standing up here explaining to you why, for instance, they approve of the right for gay and transgender and other people to marry. There is a cultural shift going on. And I'm one of the people who has been part of that shift, although I made my shift about 30 years ago when I fled, and I think that's the correct word, the far right of the religious right. And one of the reasons I got out was the way that I saw the bigotry being directed against anybody who filled in the blank on who the other was. No one more so than the gay community. And quite honestly, as a younger man approaching my 30s, having been my dad's nepotistic sidekick for those years, I realized I faced a decision, and that was that I had to either accept this inherited mantle of leadership, being flown around, for instance, in Jerry Falwell's jet that he lent me, speaking down there at his college, being the keynote speaker at the Southern Baptist Convention one year, filling in for my dad, who at that time was dying of cancer, making quite a bit of money, I may add, a better living then than I made now, and that's not even adjusted for inflation. Big bucks in them there, God business. Or really be able to live a life as a human being that I could be proud of, that I could share with my children, that I could go back home from a speaking engagement and not just fight with my wife feeling rabid and crazy, because increasingly realizing that I had been born into a family business, as it were, that I didn't fit with. And the issue of how gay people were treated, and then my view of these things, began to change along with my politics, along with my religious convictions, to a more progressive kind of inclusive Christianity. And so my own journey, in a way, mirrors, I think, the faith journey of a huge generational chunk of people that are coming along now. It's a different world. And one of the ways that I found that indicated was that when I wrote this memoir, Crazy for God, I had been out of the loop of the evangelical community for so long that in my mind I would get nothing but trouble from people who came from that background. And quite to my surprise, the emails I was getting were running 10 to 1, saying something like, "Thank you for telling my story." Now, obviously, they weren't speaking literally, but lots of folks are on this journey. So I would say to those of you who, like Wayne, who are fighting this battle, and like the other organizations represented here today, there is a good future in terms of an outcome for this if we can hang in there. And I would say, in terms of representing my own changed thinking on this issue, I want to share with you just one short paragraph out of a book that's just been published of mine, a novel called And God Said Billy, which charts the journey of a religiously convicted, delusional individual who goes out to Hollywood in the mid-'80s thinking God's called him there to save it. Very similar to my journey. Winds up at the end of the book, without doing a spoiler here, in a monastic community in the desert with an eccentric monk and abbot who has a very different view and actually tells Billy that the only road back to God is for him to become an atheist, because he says, your view of God and divinity is so screwed up that whatever you think of as religion has been ruined for you. Better for you to be an atheist. That will bring you closer to God than to be that kind of Christian. And I really think that, in a way, is both a logical and spiritual piece of advice. There are things that take us far further away from God than no religious involvement at all, if it leads you towards the kind of hatred and exclusion that so much American religion has gone toward. So let me just conclude by giving you a little taste. This is actually a work of humor, and at the end gets very serious with some advice the monk gives him. And he's asking the monk, how can you be a, quote, real Christian while you're so inclusive of, for instance, the other gay monks in the community and other people there? And so finally, the abbot writes him a little memo, and here's a couple of sentences out of it. We can have it both ways, defend the best of tradition, for instance, our glorious liturgies in the English of Shakespeare's glorious language, and yet move forward because we know that God's creation of creation is ongoing and will never complete. If creation is judged changeless and complete, say in the frozen roles of men and women, and if rules cannot be changed, then that militates against the idea that God is infinite. Stasis binds God to time and place, and therefore he, she, or it is no longer God. And a little later, the monk concludes by telling him there is only one defense against the rising worldwide fear-filled fundamentalist tide engulfing all religions. Speaking of Tony Perkins. The embrace of paradox and uncertainty as the virtuoso expression of Christ-like humility. Our egos must be curtailed by what we do not know, which is far more than what we do know. This humility is rooted in a fact. We are at the beginning of creation and don't have any clue as to how things will grow and change. And that kind of voice, of course, I put it in the mouth of a very holy abbot, is what I have come to believe. And it represents a change from someone who would have been appalled at this gathering 30 years ago and would have been on the other side today. And from there, I have grown. And I would just conclude by saying, if that's possible for the son of Francis Schaeffer, if it's possible for one of the firebrand instigators of the religious right, it is possible for this country. And I think in the generational shift, we're seeing that change. And it is the shift that I try to track through in this book, And God Said Billy, from religious delusion to a kind of a sanity found in compassion and love of the other. And I think it's a journey that we need to encourage people to take, and I commend you for taking this journey and helping others take it. Thank you.